When we start to look closely at the details surrounding what JonBenet was wearing on that last night, it quickly becomes clear that the story isn't as straightforward as it might first seem. Maybe Patsy's initial statements about JonBenet refusing certain clothes were genuine memories, but then we see shifts in her accounts that raise questions. If we dig a little deeper, the inconsistencies in the descriptions of her outfits, white shirts, black velvet pants, long johns that might not even have been hers, start to paint a complicated picture. And if we consider the physical evidence, like those mysterious black wool fibers found inside her long johns, it pushes us to think beyond the surface of what was said and look at what the facts really suggest. It's also worth thinking about the missing Barbie nightgown, which seems like a small detail until you realize how significant it becomes in the narrative. The fact that it disappeared despite being supposedly easy to find raises eyebrows, especially when theories emerge about an intruder specifically targeting it. That kind of focused behavior feels less like a random crime and more like something deeply personal. And when these clothing contradictions intersect with fiber evidence and the nightgown mystery, they don't just create confusion. They form a web of questions that pull us into the heart of the case. So as we move into the analysis, we want to hold on to both the human element, the memories, the possible mistakes, the emotions, and the forensic realities that demand objective scrutiny. There's a delicate balance between understanding how trauma can affect recollection and recognizing when physical evidence points us in directions that words alone can't. With all this in mind, let's dive deeper into the themes that make this clothing story so crucial to unraveling what truly happened. Christmas morning, presents and breakfast. On Christmas morning, the Ramsey family's tradition began early. In his 2001 deposition, Jon Ramsey recalled the children bounding into our room that morning excited to open their presents. He further elaborated in his 1998 interview, explaining that their normal routine was for him to go downstairs first, turn on the Christmas tree lights, and then have the kids come down to open presents. He liked to make them wait a little bit to build anticipation. As for what was said during this exciting time, in his 1998 interview, Jon Ramsey specifically remembered JonBenet receiving a look-alike doll that was supposed to resemble her. Her reaction was, "This doesn't look like me." This playful, childish observation stands out as a memorable moment for Jon. Both Jon and Patsy were casually dressed for the present opening in pajamas and robes. Patsy Ramsey, in her 1997 interview, noted that JonBenet was wearing pink little kind of insulated underwear tops and bottoms that day. Jon Ramsey also recalled this in his 1998 interview, stating she had on a little pink, like a long underwear bottoms and top. Following the present opening, in a 1998 interview, Jon Ramsey stated that they usually had a special breakfast, which he believed was pancakes that Christmas day, possibly accompanied by bacon and hash. While the specific breakfast items are recalled, the sources do not detail any particular conversations between Jon and JonBenet during this meal. Okay, so let's first think about the inconsistencies in timing of clothing worn by Jon and Patsy on that critical day. At first glance, it seems straightforward. They started the morning dressed casually, in robes and pajamas, just like many families might on Christmas morning. But then we have these fibers from Jon's black collared shirt, an expensive wool shirt made in Israel, found in the basement and other crime scene locations. That immediately makes us wonder, when exactly was Jon wearing that shirt? Because if he started in pajamas and only changed later, how and when did those fibers travel into places like the basement? From a logical perspective, this timing question is vital because it affects how we reconstruct movements and possible interactions. And we can also think about the physiology of clothing fibers and how they transfer. Wool fibers, especially from high-quality garments, tend to shed, but not massively so unless there is direct contact or friction. So finding those fibers everywhere isn't as simple as saying it's their house, and therefore the fibers are everywhere. The technical term here is secondary transfer, meaning fibers can move indirectly, but generally the closer and more frequent the contact, the more fibers get deposited. So if Jon wasn't wearing that black shirt until later in the day, the spread and location of those fibers can tell us a lot about when and where he moved around. This kind of detail is often overlooked but is crucial in forensic fiber analysis. Along the same lines, what's funny is how these little details in clothing, something so mundane, become pivotal in a criminal investigation. When the fibers are linked to a specific garment that has a distinct origin, like the wool shirt from Israel, it raises the stakes. It's like finding a unique fingerprint but in fabric form. So logically, the presence of these fibers in unexpected places forces us to consider scenarios. Was Jon in the basement earlier than he claimed? Or did those fibers get transferred by someone else wearing similar fabric? The timing of clothing changes is a puzzle piece that impacts the whole story. What might be worth noting is how Patsy's clothing fibers come into play as well. She reportedly started in pajamas too, yet her fibers were found all over the crime scene, including in the basement. This raises a similar timing question. When did she change? Did she spend significant time in the basement while dressed in those later clothes? From a forensic framing viewpoint, every fiber tells a story of movement and presence, and conflicting accounts about clothing changes introduce doubt about the accuracy of the timeline presented by the parents. From a criminological perspective, inconsistencies in something as simple as when someone changed clothes can suggest deeper issues. Maybe the clothing timeline is being manipulated, consciously or unconsciously, to hide movements or actions. Criminals often try to create alibis by establishing where they were dressed a certain way or controlling when and how they appeared in different garments. So paying close attention to these clothing details can reveal contradictions that may point to deception or cover-up. And remember, in layman's terms, fiber analysis is like piecing together footprints. When someone wears a piece of clothing, bits of fabric come off and stick to surfaces. The pattern and quantity of these fibers can indicate how long someone was in a place or how often they moved through an area. If John or Patsy said they only wore those clothes after a certain time, but the fibers tell another story, that's a big red flag for investigators. Getting inside the mind of the killer, or even someone involved in staging or covering up, means understanding how such details might be overlooked or underestimated by the public, but are gold mines for forensic experts. A calculated offender knows that controlling timelines and clothing appearances can help mislead investigators. They might even exploit the confusion caused by changing clothes or moving fibers around to create a smokescreen. This shows a cold, tactical mindset focused on manipulation at every level. Finally, what's interesting and frankly a little unsettling is how the intimate details of daily routine clothing can become keys to unraveling the truth. The casual act of putting on or taking off a shirt, something we all do without thinking, becomes a forensic clue that can make or break a timeline. It's a reminder of how in forensic science no detail is too small, and the mundane often holds the most important answers in tragic cases like this. And we can continue to think about the significance and origin of the black wool fibers linked to John's shirt, and how that plays into the bigger picture. What's fascinating here is that the shirt wasn't just any shirt. It was made in Israel from a special kind of wool thread, which isn't something you find just anywhere. So the presence of these distinctive fibers at the crime scene, especially in the basement where the tragedy unfolded, immediately raises questions about how and when those fibers got there. It's a detail that logically points us towards scrutinizing movements and timing with greater precision. Along the same lines, from a forensic science perspective, fiber analysis works by matching the physical characteristics of fibers found at a scene to known sources, like a specific garment owned by a suspect. The rarity or uniqueness of the fiber material, such as this particular wool, increases the strength of that connection. So when experts find these black wool fibers in places where John claimed not to have been or not to have worn that shirt yet, it casts doubt on the timeline he provided. The technical term here is associative evidence, meaning the fibers physically link a person or their clothing to a location. And that can be powerful in piecing together the sequence of events. What might be worth noting is that the presence of these fibers also opens up questions about transfer mechanisms. Wool fibers can shed easily with movement, but how did they spread throughout the basement and other parts of the house? Was it direct contact, John walking around wearing the shirt, or could they have been transferred indirectly, for example, through other people touching clothing or objects? Understanding these pathways is crucial because it helps forensic analysts distinguish between innocent fiber presence and evidence of relevant activity. From a criminological standpoint, the black wool fibers can be viewed as silent witnesses, small clues that don't lie but need careful interpretation. If the fibers show up in places inconsistent with the suspect's story, it may indicate attempts to conceal or distort movements. Criminals sometimes mismanage their clothing or underestimate how fibers cling and spread, which can betray them. This kind of physical evidence helps investigators cut through conflicting narratives and focus on what actually happened. And remember, explaining this in layman's terms, fiber evidence is a bit like dust. You don't notice it until it's in the wrong place. If you see a unique fiber in a spot where it shouldn't logically be, it's a hint someone was there or something was moved. In this case, those black wool fibers from the special shirt are clues that tell a story about presence, movement, and possibly concealment. Getting inside the mind of the person involved, if they knew the shirt and its fibers were so distinctive, they might have been cautious about where and when they wore it. Alternatively, they might have been careless or confident that such details wouldn't be noticed. This reveals different personality traits, either meticulous planning or reckless disregard, that forensic psychologists use to profile suspects and understand their behaviors. What's also interesting, and a little ironic, is that something as simple as fibers from a wool shirt, something many might overlook in daily life, can become a cornerstone of forensic evidence. It shows how science turns the ordinary into extraordinary clues that can confirm or contradict statements, unravel timelines, and ultimately help solve crimes. Finally, when we think about the origin and spread of these black wool fibers, it reminds us that every thread, every tiny piece of evidence, can hold immense significance. In a complex case like this, where words and memories conflict, physical traces like fibers provide a tangible, objective foundation for understanding what truly happened. And we can continue to think about the conflicting accounts regarding who dressed JonBenet and why this contradiction matters so much. On the surface, it might seem like a simple detail, who helped get a child dressed for the day or an event, but in the context of this case, it becomes a puzzle piece with serious implications. John claims Patsy dressed the kids, while fiber evidence suggests John may have been directly involved in dressing JonBenet at some point. That mismatch throws the timeline and narratives into question and pushes us to ask, why do these stories not line up? Along the same lines, from a logical and deductive reasoning standpoint, consistency is key. If John insists Patsy took care of dressing JonBenet, but evidence points to John's clothing fibers on JonBenet's pajamas or long johns, then either someone is mistaken or something is being concealed. This kind of inconsistency can't be brushed off as a simple oversight because clothing is a tangible item that leaves physical traces, and forensic analysis can detect these fibers to a high degree of certainty. So when accounts and evidence don't align, it signals that the truth is more complicated. What might be worth noting is the potential psychological and interpersonal dynamics behind these contradictory statements. Sometimes, in high stress or traumatic situations, memories become fragmented or selective. It's possible that John and Patsy remember or want to portray events differently to protect themselves or manage guilt and blame. From a criminological perspective, conflicting accounts within families are often red flags that investigators examine closely, as they might indicate deception, confusion, or attempts at controlling the narrative. And when we consider the forensic framing, the question of who dressed JonBenet is more than just about clothing. It's about opportunity and presence. Whoever dressed her had close, intimate contact with her at a crucial moment. If John dressed JonBenet before going to the party, and that conflicts with Patsy's statements, then the timing of interactions and movements around the home becomes murkier. This impacts how investigators view potential windows of opportunity for the crime. In layman's terms, think of it like this. Dressing a child isn't a fleeting, hands-off act. It's close contact, and during that process, fibers can transfer from clothing to skin and pajamas. So forensic experts treat these fibers like fingerprints. They're evidence of who was physically close and when. Conflicting stories about who dressed JonBenet create tension between what's said and what's physically indicated, which is a big deal in investigations. Getting inside the mind of someone giving contradictory accounts can reveal motivations like fear, denial, or a desire to protect loved ones. Sometimes people aren't fully aware of how their statements conflict because of stress or trauma. Other times, they might consciously alter stories to mislead. Profilers use these behavioral clues to assess credibility and to understand the psychological environment surrounding a crime. What's interesting, and maybe a little revealing, is how this contradiction over something as everyday as dressing a child can become a linchpin for suspicion. It highlights how small details in family routines can carry enormous weight when reconstructing a crime. It also shows the challenge investigators face in separating genuine confusion from purposeful deception. Finally, considering these conflicting accounts reminds us that in forensic investigations, nothing is trivial. Every inconsistency invites deeper inquiry, and every small detail can crack open larger truths. The question of who dressed JonBenet is a perfect example of how family dynamics, memory, physical evidence, and psychology intertwine in the search for answers. Christmas Day, airport return, and general interactions. After the morning festivities, the family's day continued with John Ramsey heading to the airport. In his 1998 interview, John Ramsey explained that he went to the Stevens Aviation hangar to prepare their airplane for an upcoming trip to Charlevoix, where they planned a second Christmas with his older children. He spent a few hours there, cleaning and getting the plane ready, and spoke to one of the line guys, though he couldn't recall his name. He estimates he returned home around 3 p.m. Upon his return, in his 1998 interview, John Ramsey remembered that there were some kids around and kids were playing at the house, and they were preparing to go to the Whites' party. He did not detail specific direct interactions with JonBenet at this exact moment, but rather the general atmosphere of children playing. Patsy Ramsey, in her 2000 interview, stated that she helped JonBenet get dressed for the Whites' Christmas dinner, and John did not assist with this. A notable interaction between John and JonBenet that evening, prior to the party, was recalled by John Ramsey in his 1998 interview. He remembers specifically playing with JonBenet and a little jewelry maker wrapped up in little strips of paper and little beads. This suggests a shared bonding activity. Later in the same interview, Lou Smith inquired if John had noticed a heart drawn on JonBenet's hand while they were making jewelry, to which John responded that he didn't notice anything. This interaction highlights a close physical proximity during this shared activity. Throughout the day, John Ramsey's statements in his 1998 interview imply a tone of normal family activity and enjoyment. JonBenet was described as fascinated with Santa Claus at an earlier Christmas party, and she rode her new bike around the patio on Christmas Day, with Patsy Ramsey confirming the weather was sunny, nice for this activity. While JonBenet was miffed on Christmas Eve about not being allowed to walk to the star, there are no indications of significant negative interactions or arguments between John and JonBenet on Christmas Day itself. Okay, so let's first think about this idea of Patsy claiming she helped dress JonBenet for the party. On the surface, it seems like a straightforward, almost mundane detail, a mother helping her child get ready for an event. But in the context of this case, every small action is loaded with significance, especially when it comes to timelines and physical evidence. Patsy's statement, and notably John's lack of contradiction, becomes a key touchpoint for understanding who was where and when. Logically, if Patsy was involved in dressing JonBenet, it suggests a close physical interaction between mother and daughter at a particular moment that investigators want to pinpoint. And we can also think about how this interaction might have physiological underpinnings that matter. Dressing a child isn't just about putting on clothes. It involves close bodily contact, touching arms, legs, helping with buttons, zippers, and layers. From a forensic science standpoint, this kind of contact can result in the transfer of fibers, skin cells, or other trace evidence. So when fiber analysis shows traces linked to John's clothing on JonBenet's garments, it's natural to ask whether the dressing process involved him, or if those fibers were transferred through another interaction. This detail ties Patsy's claim directly into the physical evidence narrative. Along those lines, what's funny is how such an ordinary parenting moment becomes a critical piece in the larger investigation. It raises questions like, was Patsy's version the whole truth? Or is it possible John also dressed JonBenet at some point, contradicting earlier claims? These kinds of discrepancies can complicate timelines and lead to alternative theories about who had intimate access to JonBenet before the party. From a deductive reasoning angle, inconsistencies between statements and evidence demand careful scrutiny. What might be worth noting is how forensic framing uses these small details to reconstruct sequences of events. The act of dressing can be pinpointed as a moment when evidence like fibers could be deposited. If the fibers from John's black shirt are found in places on JonBenet's clothing that suggest close contact, it could indicate he dressed her or was physically very close to her. This puts that claim under a microscope and shapes how investigators interpret parental involvement and presence. From a criminological perspective, the differing accounts around dressing JonBenet also open up questions about motive and opportunity. Who dressed her can reflect who had control, influence, or access at critical moments. Sometimes, criminals try to distance themselves from such acts to avoid suspicion, so any discrepancy here could be a subtle form of self-protection or concealment. Understanding this helps investigators form psychological profiles and examine behaviors that might seem minor but actually signal much larger dynamics. In layman's terms, think of dressing a child like a close handshake that leaves behind traces, fibers, scents, skin cells. When forensic scientists find these traces, they are like breadcrumbs leading back to who was physically involved. So if Patsy says she dressed JonBenet, but evidence suggests John's fibers are also present, it means the story might not be as simple as it sounds. This is why fiber analysis is so powerful. It's a silent witness to physical closeness. Getting inside the mind of the killer or any suspect involved in manipulating narratives about these moments, it's possible they intentionally obscure or shift responsibility. They might do this to confuse investigators or protect themselves. The psychological drive to control the narrative is strong, especially in high-stakes cases. Understanding this can explain why there might be conflicting statements about something as basic as who dressed the child. Finally, what's really intriguing and a little unsettling is how such a seemingly small act like helping a child get dressed can become a focal point for suspicion and forensic examination. It reminds us that in investigations, no detail is too trivial, and the everyday can hold the key to unlocking larger truths about what happened. So by examining Patsy's claim closely, alongside the physical evidence and behavioral insights, we gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of the final hours before tragedy struck. And we can continue to think about the puzzling presence of those black wool fibers inside JonBenét's long johns, because that detail really throws a wrench in the straightforward explanations. Usually fibers get on the outside of clothing from contact with carpets, furniture, or other fabrics, but finding a mass of fibers on the inside is far less common and much harder to explain. It suggests direct and intimate contact with a fabric or garment that was in close proximity, maybe even worn by someone else during a very specific moment. This immediately makes us ask, how did those fibers get there and when? Along the same lines, from a forensic science perspective, the inside of a garment is usually protected from casual contamination. For fibers to end up there, it often requires that the garment was either removed or handled extensively in a setting where those fibers were present. So if John's black wool fibers were inside JonBenét's long johns, it's logical to consider that her clothes were taken off or adjusted in an environment saturated with those fibers, like the basement mentioned in the investigation. That's a crucial detail because it narrows down the possible times and places where this interaction happened. What might be worth noting is how this challenges innocent assumptions. It's easy to say, oh, it's their house, fibers are everywhere, but the forensic nuance here is that fiber location matters. Fibers on the outside can come from simple contact, but fibers inside require more deliberate or prolonged contact. So the idea that these black fibers magically got inside the long johns without direct contact strains credibility. This raises questions about who handled JonBenét's clothing and under what circumstances. From a criminological angle, this fiber presence can be interpreted as evidence of a close, possibly controlling interaction. Whoever caused the fibers to get inside the clothing likely had a moment of physical dominance or care, dressing, undressing, or manipulating JonBenét's garments. Such an act is important because it places a person intimately close to the victim at a critical moment, possibly narrowing suspect opportunities. In layman's terms, think of the inside of clothing like the private space. Harder to get fibers in there unless someone is really close or the clothes are off. It's not like fibers drift in through the air, they cling through direct contact. This makes the fiber evidence compelling because it implies a closeness that aligns with key moments being examined in the case. Getting inside the mind of the person involved, if they were responsible for those fibers inside the long johns, they either knowingly or unknowingly left a trace of themselves that speaks louder than words. This might suggest either carelessness or a lack of awareness of forensic science. Or, on the other hand, it could imply a calculated risk, knowing they had that level of access to JonBenet. What's also interesting, and maybe a bit ironic, is how a tiny piece of fabric can tell us so much about what happened in a hidden corner of the house. The fibers act like silent witnesses, revealing actions and locations that other evidence might miss or that witnesses might deny. This shows the power of forensic science to find truth in the smallest details. Finally, the puzzling presence of black wool fibers inside JonBenét's long johns isn't just a minor forensic footnote. It's a key thread weaving through the narrative of who was close to JonBenet and when. Understanding this helps build a clearer picture of the events leading up to the tragedy and sharpens the focus on critical moments in the investigation. And we can continue to think about the implications of that interaction involving fiber transfer, because this is where the forensic details start to tell a much deeper story. Fiber transfer isn't just about stray threads floating around, it's about physical contact, close, often intimate contact, that leaves behind traces linking people to places or to each other. So when we find John's distinctive black wool fibers inside JonBenét's clothing, it implies a direct interaction that happened under circumstances allowing for such transfer. This isn't just incidental, it's a forensic footprint that demands careful interpretation. Along the same lines, it's worth considering how fiber transfer occurs in technical terms. When two fabrics come into contact, especially during movements like dressing or undressing, fibers can transfer from one to another. The amount, location, and condition of those fibers can reveal the nature and duration of contact. In this case, fibers found inside the long john suggest the garment was handled or worn in close proximity to John's shirt, probably in a place rich with those fibers, like the basement. This technical insight helps investigators establish not only presence, but also timing and context of interactions. What might be worth noting is how these transfer patterns challenge simple narratives about who was involved and what happened when. If Patsy says she dressed JonBenet, but fiber evidence suggests John's clothing fibers were inside her pajamas, we're forced to question if there were other moments when John was physically close to her. It complicates the timeline and suggests the possibility of multiple interactions in different locations, which in turn impacts suspect theories and motive interpretations. From a criminological perspective, understanding fiber transfer in this context can highlight power dynamics and behavioral patterns. Close contact required for such transfer might indicate control, caregiving, or even aggression, depending on circumstances. This forensic clue helps reconstruct not just physical movements but psychological interactions, providing insight into relationships and possible intent. In layman's terms, think of fiber transfer like fingerprints. It's physical proof of who touched what and when. And unlike fingerprints, fibers can sometimes tell us about the nature of the contact, whether it was casual brushing or prolonged handling. This makes them invaluable in cases where direct eyewitness accounts are missing or contradictory. Getting inside the mind of a suspect involved in such close interaction means considering their awareness of these physical traces. Some offenders underestimate forensic science and leave behind telltale signs, while others try to cover their tracks, but inadvertently reveal more through overlooked details like fibers. This interplay between intentional concealment and forensic discovery is a dance investigators are always trying to decode. What's interesting and somewhat ironic is how something as small and seemingly insignificant as a fiber can unravel carefully constructed alibis or narratives. It reminds us that in forensic science, the devil really is in the details, and that no evidence is too small to matter when trying to uncover the truth. Finally, the implications of fiber transfer in this case stretch beyond mere presence. They connect behavior, timing, and environment to build a more complete understanding of what happened. Recognizing this helps sharpen investigative focus and brings us closer to piecing together the complex dynamics at play on that tragic day. Christmas night, car ride home, and bedtime. The evening of Christmas Day concluded with a party at the White House. In his 1997 interview, Jon Ramsey recalled leaving the party between 8:30 p.m. and 8:45 p.m. Patsy Ramsey, in her 2000 interview, estimates they left around 9 p.m. and made 2 stops to drop off presents at the Walkers and the Steins. During the car ride home, in his 1998 interview, Jon Ramsey stated that JonBenet was sound asleep when they pulled into their driveway, so much so that he remembered getting her out of the car and she was just out. He described her as really out and that he struggled a little bit to get her out of the 4-door car into his arms, yet she didn't wake up. Upon arriving home, Jon Ramsey carried JonBenet up the back stairs and lay her on the bed. He recalled in his 1998 interview that he didn't remember the cover, if the bed was made or not, but he placed her on the bed, anticipating that Patsy would then follow up to put her nightgown on and get her ready for bed. Patsy Ramsey corroborated this in her 2000 interview, explaining that John carried JonBenet up and put her on the bed, and then she took over. Patsy recalled putting JonBenet's pajama pants on her in the dark, as she didn't turn on the bright lights because I didn't want to wake her up. Regarding any final words or actions, Jon Ramsey, in his 1998 interview, was definitive that neither he nor Patsy fed JonBenet anything before she went to bed, stressing she was sound asleep. He emphasized her exhaustion, stating in the same interview, JonBenet had to have been very tired that night. She'd been up early for Christmas. They had been playing all day. It was just the whole day. She was absolutely sound asleep when I put her to bed, and I can't imagine her to have even gotten up to go to the bathroom. He also affirmed he had no knowledge of her getting up to drink anything after going to bed. The sources do not record any verbal interaction between John and JonBenet at this time, as she was deeply asleep and unresponsive. Now, I want to take a little bit of a look at that discussion about the nightgown. Let's delve into the perspectives of John and Patsy Ramsey regarding putting a nightgown on JonBenet on Christmas night, particularly focusing on the Barbie nightgown and whether this ever came to pass. Jon Ramsey's perspective on bedtime attire. In his 1997 interview, Jon Ramsey shared that when he brought JonBenet home from the White's Christmas party, she was sound asleep. He vividly recalled her being just out when he got her out of the car, and that he struggled a little bit to get her out of the 4-door car and carry her upstairs, yet she didn't wake up. He then carried her up the back stairs and lay her on the bed. John's expectation for the bedtime routine was that Patsy would follow up to put her nightgown on and get her ready for bed. However, in his 1997 interview, when asked if he was in JonBenet's room when Patsy put her bedclothes on, John stated, "No, I don't think so, not that I can remember." Similarly, when asked in the same interview if he could recall with certainty what JonBenet went to sleep in that night, he replied, I don't think I was, no, I don't. Despite this uncertainty about what Patsy dressed her in, John Ramsey later stated in his 1998 interview that when he laid her down in the bed, she had on what she had worn to the whites. She had that same shirt on when I found her. He reiterated that he remembered her running into her bedroom with that pink top and bottom on Christmas morning, and that she wore it for Christmas on the bicycle. He also generally noted that if JonBenet was awake when she went to bed, she got into a nightgown and brushed her teeth, got into bed, but if she was asleep, we usually just tried to make her comfortable, make sure she was warm. Didn't go into the trouble of getting her into a nightgown necessarily. Sometimes she had a t-shirt on. Pajama bottoms, maybe, yes. This suggests a flexible approach to bedtime clothing, depending on her wakefulness. Patsy Ramsey's perspective on bedtime attire. Patsy Ramsey's account in her 2000 interview aligns with John's. Regarding bringing JonBenet home, John carried her up and put her on the bed. Patsy then took over the process of getting her ready for bed. She confirmed yes when asked if she changed JonBenet's clothing when she came home to put her in clothes to sleep, and that John did not assist in putting her long johns on her for sleeping purposes. Patsy also clarified her actions in her 2000 interview. I remember dressing her pajamas pants on her. It was dark. I didn't turn on the bright lights because I didn't want to wake her up. When asked what JonBenet was wearing, Patsy stated that she had the long underwear pants and her little white shirt. This contradicts John's statement that she was found in the same shirt she wore to the whites, as well as Patsy's own recollection in the same interview that JonBenet had worn the black velvet ones to Priscilla's, and that she just can't remember what she had on earlier that day. Patsy firmly stated in her 2000 interview that JonBenet did not wear the pink pajama top from Christmas morning, Christmas night. The Barbie nightgown, did it happen? Both John and Patsy acknowledged the existence of a Barbie nightgown. In her 1997 interview, Patsy said, she had a Barbie nightgown, but I don't know if we had a specific pageant nightgown. John, in his 1998 interview, also recalled, I think she had a Barbie nightgown. Yeah, as I recall, pink maybe. However, neither John nor Patsy recalls the Barbie nightgown being put on JonBenet on Christmas night. In his 1998 interview, John explicitly stated that when he laid JonBenet down, she had on what she had worn to the whites. She had that same shirt on when I found her. Patsy, in her 2000 interview, confirmed that JonBenet didn't wear it that night because she had her. She had the long underwear pants and her little white shirt. As for where it was kept, John Ramsey in his 1998 interview speculated it would have either been in her bathroom drawer here, which a lot of them were kept, or on the floor, or it would have been in the washing machine. Patsy Ramsey corroborated this in her 2000 interview, stating the nightgowns were kept in the bathroom, in her bathroom in the side drawer there. Her pajamas were there. When shown a photograph of her bathroom, she pointed to a drawer and said the Barbie nightgown probably would have been kept in that one or the one below it. She also mentioned that her favorite pajamas were a one-piece sort of genie thing that her mother had given her, but didn't refer to the Barbie nightgown as particularly special, other than it being one of many. The Barbie nightgown gained significance because it was found in an unexpected location. In his 1998 interview, John Ramsey mentioned there was a nightgown that was found down in the wine cellar. He had heard about that, but had never seen that and found it very bizarre, as that room was usually full of Christmas stuff and a nasty room that they didn't go in there. He reiterated that the fact it was found in the basement and that Patsy didn't recognize it was significant to him because she knows stuff like that. When Patsy Ramsey was shown a photograph of the wine cellar in her 2000 interview, she identified a pink thing in the image, asking, "What is the pink thing?" before identifying it as her Barbie nightgown. However, she immediately followed up with, "Why was that there?" She also expressed some uncertainty about if it was the Barbie nightgown she was thinking of, stating, "I'm thinking of a Barbie nightgown that had a big face of Barbie. I remember a Barbie nightgown with a big picture of the head of Barbie on it. So I am not quite sure this is her, one that she had." John also observed that the nightgown in the photo looked shinier and more dressy than what he remembered as a cloth Barbie nightgown. Both John and Patsy were clear that the Barbie nightgown found in the wine cellar should not have been there. Patsy stated, "Regardless, it is totally out of place down there in the wine cellar." She confirmed that she don't believe I did go back into the wine cellar on Christmas Day, and that the nightgown wasn't there when she was last in the wine cellar on Christmas Eve. John, too, couldn't explain its presence, stating, "I don't. It certainly should not be." Crucially, in her 1998 interview, Patsy specifically addressed the reason for the long underwear. "I remember I was digging around for something. I was trying to find the pink ones she wore the night before. I couldn't put my hand on them right quick. And so I went to these drawers looking for the pajamas, and she was just laying there. So I didn't want to raise her up and get everything off of her to put a long nightgown. So looking for pajamas bottoms to put on her. I couldn't find any, and the long underwear pants were in their drawer, so I got those. Okay, so let's first think about these conflicting accounts regarding what JonBenet wore that night, because this is where the story starts to get really tangled. In 1997, Patsy was quite firm that JonBenet refused to wear matching black pants and a red sweater, instead wanting to wear a white shirt and white pants from the Gap. But then, by 1998, we hear something different. Patsy admits to dressing JonBenet in black velvet pants, possibly against her will. That shift raises immediate questions. Why the change? Was it a slip-up or something more? From a logical and deductive perspective, these contradictions weaken the reliability of the narrative and suggest that the clothing timeline might have been adjusted or confused over time. And we can also think about what this inconsistency means physiologically. Clothes aren't just fabric, they're part of a child's comfort and routine. A child refusing to wear something can be a big deal, especially a 6-year-old who might be particular about textures, colors, or fit. So Patsy's initial claim about JonBenet rejecting the black outfit seems plausible on a human level. But then to later admit dressing her in those very pants introduces cognitive dissonance that's hard to ignore. It makes us wonder if there were underlying tensions, maybe between the parents or between mother and child, that influenced how the clothing story evolved. Along the same lines, what's funny about this is how much weight we place on clothing details in forensic investigations, yet how little clarity we sometimes get. Clothing is such a basic thing, but when memories falter or change, the significance of those details skyrockets. From a forensic framing point of view, the exact clothes JonBenet wore impact timelines, fiber evidence, and even motive theories. If the clothing story shifts, it complicates the task of building a consistent reconstruction of events. What might be worth noting is how this inconsistency also affects perceptions of parental credibility. If Patsy's statements about JonBenet's clothing don't align over time, it's natural for investigators and the public to question other aspects of the story. Criminology teaches us that inconsistencies in seemingly small details can hint at larger concealments or attempts to reshape narratives. That said, it's also important to remember that human memory is fallible and influenced by stress, trauma, and passage of time, which can explain some, but not all, discrepancies. From a layman's explanation standpoint, imagine trying to remember exactly what your child wore 2 years ago on a stressful day. It's easy to get colors, textures, or details mixed up. But in an investigation, those details are treated like puzzle pieces. Getting one wrong can throw off the whole picture. So even a slip-up in describing clothing can have outsized consequences when piecing together the timeline or matching forensic evidence. Getting inside the mind of the killer or someone trying to cover their tracks adds another layer here. If clothing details are inconsistent, that might indicate attempts to confuse or mislead investigators. A killer or accomplice who knows the importance of these details could exploit the ambiguity to muddy the waters. This kind of psychological manipulation is common in criminal behavior, especially when suspects realize that seemingly trivial details can unravel their alibis. What's also interesting is how these conflicting clothing accounts intersect with other forensic elements, like fiber transfers and clothing found at the scene. If JonBenet was indeed wearing black velvet pants and fibers from John's shirt are found on her clothing, it changes the way we interpret presence and contact in the home. It tightens the timeline and spatial relations in the investigation. But if she was in white clothing, those same fibers become harder to explain logically. So the clothing story directly influences how we interpret physical evidence. Finally, maybe what's worth emphasizing is that clothing in this case is more than just fabric on a child. It's a symbol of control, routine, and possibly resistance. The conflicting accounts about what JonBenet wore are windows into family dynamics, memory reliability, and investigative challenges. By exploring these contradictions closely, we open the door to a richer understanding of the emotional and forensic landscape surrounding that tragic night. And we can continue to think about the mysterious disappearance and significance of the Barbie nightgown, because that's where the story takes an even stranger turn. Patsy talks about how JonBenet typically wore the Barbie nightgown and that it should have been easy to find, in her bathroom drawer, the washer, or the dryer. Yet mysteriously, it's nowhere to be found on the night in question. This absence raises a big question. If the nightgown was missing, who took it and why? The idea that an intruder specifically sought out and took the nightgown before even having contact with JonBenet suggests a disturbing level of intent and planning. It's a detail that pushes us to reconsider whether this was a random crime or something more personal. Along the same lines, from a logical and deductive reasoning perspective, the intruder's behavior around the nightgown challenges common theories about the crime. If someone had a grudge against John Ramsey, why would they care enough about JonBenet's nightgown to take it? The focus on JonBenet's personal item implies the perpetrator had a fixation on her, which shifts the narrative away from a burglary gone wrong towards something more targeted. This kind of detail reshapes how investigators think about motive and suspect profiles. What might be worth noting is how the missing nightgown also affects the timeline and movement within the house. The theory that the intruder went upstairs, searched the bedroom, found the nightgown, and either waited with it or took it downstairs is loaded with implications. It suggests the intruder had time and confidence inside the home, contrary to the idea of a quick, chaotic crime. This level of calm and control can inform forensic framing and psychological profiling, hinting at a perpetrator who was deliberate and methodical. From a criminological standpoint, personal items like a child's nightgown often hold symbolic value for offenders. Taking or manipulating such objects can be a way to exert control, humiliate, or terrorize. The fact that this nightgown was singled out, if indeed it was, may reflect deeper psychological motives rooted in obsession or anger focused on JonBenet specifically. Understanding this symbolism helps shape suspect profiles and investigative priorities. In layman's terms, losing a beloved nightgown might seem trivial, but in this case, it's like a red flag waving. It tells us the intruder was not just opportunistic but had a specific focus, enough to take the time to find and remove this personal item. That kind of behavior is far from random, it's purposeful and telling. Getting inside the mind of the perpetrator again, the act of taking the nightgown can be seen as a form of psychological domination or signature. It's a way of marking the crime scene with a personal touch, sending a message or satisfying some twisted need. This behavior is a common theme in certain types of offenders who use objects as extensions of control and fear. What's also interesting and chilling is how such a small piece of clothing becomes a central clue that opens up larger questions about the nature of the crime. It shifts the investigation from surface-level details to the deeper psychological and behavioral patterns of the offender. That makes the missing Barbie nightgown a key piece of the puzzle. Finally, reflecting on the nightgown's disappearance reminds us that in forensic investigations, personal items often hold outsized significance. They are not just things, they are symbols loaded with meaning. Exploring the story around JonBenet's nightgown helps us understand the complexity and dark intention behind the crime, pushing the narrative beyond a simple burglary to something far more disturbing and focused. And we can continue to think about the questions surrounding the practicality and appropriateness of JonBenet's long johns, because this is one of those details that seems small, but actually carries a lot of weight when you dig into it. Long johns are typically worn as undergarments meant to provide warmth under outer clothing, not as standalone pants for walking around in the house or outside. So hearing that JonBenet was wearing these long johns in place of proper pants raises some eyebrows. If we consider the logical side, it doesn't quite fit the usual behavior of dressing a child for an event or even for bedtime, especially when Patsy insists JonBenet wouldn't be dressed casually or in anything less than appropriate attire. Along the same lines, it's interesting to look at the debate about whether these long johns belong to boys or girls, because that touches on family dynamics and attention to detail. If the long johns were indeed boys' clothing, then the question becomes, why would JonBenet be wearing them? Was it a matter of practicality, convenience, or something else? It might indicate a rushed or inattentive dressing process, or possibly some other underlying tension in the household. From a forensic framing perspective, this kind of clothing inconsistency adds another layer of uncertainty about what really happened that night. What might be worth noting is how the practicality of clothing ties into the timeline and the forensic evidence. If JonBenet was wearing these long johns as her primary pants, that affects how fiber evidence, blood spatter, or other physical traces are interpreted. Different fabrics react differently and can tell investigators about movement, contact, or even how injuries occurred. So the exact nature and appropriateness of the clothing isn't just a side detail, it can influence the entire reconstruction of events. From a criminological viewpoint, the question of clothing appropriateness can also signal behavioral clues. Offenders or people involved in a crime sometimes manipulate clothing to confuse investigators or to create a certain impression. If JonBenét's attire seems out of place or inconsistent with normal behavior, it might suggest staging or attempts to mislead. It also opens the door to theories about who dressed her and why certain choices were made. In layman's terms, think about how you or a parent would dress a child for a holiday event or even for bed. You'd usually pick something comfortable, appropriate, and fitting. Wearing boys' long johns or casual pants that don't match the occasion stands out as unusual and invites questions. It's not just about fashion, it's about what those choices say about the environment and the people involved. Getting inside the mind of someone making these clothing decisions, whether a parent or an intruder, means considering intent and awareness. Was it a rushed decision? Was there carelessness, indifference, or something more deliberate? These choices can reflect psychological states or strategies in the unfolding of events. For investigators and profilers, such details help piece together the mindset behind the actions. What's also funny, or maybe ironic, is how clothing, something we usually take for granted, becomes a focal point of suspicion and analysis in forensic investigations. It reminds us how the ordinary becomes extraordinary when tragedy strikes, and how tiny details can hold big secrets. Finally, thinking about the practicality and appropriateness of JonBenét's long johns helps us understand not just what she wore, but what her clothing reveals about the final hours, whether it was normal routine, rushed chaos, or something deliberately altered. That insight deepens our grasp of the mystery and challenges us to look beyond appearances to the underlying truths. When we pull together these threads about JonBenét's clothing, what stands out most is how much discrepancy there is, especially around something as seemingly straightforward as what she wore on that final night. The story that she was dressed in long johns that don't quite fit the image of a child dressed for an occasion feels odd from the start. It's not just a minor wardrobe choice, it challenges the narrative about normalcy and care in those last hours. When a child's clothing doesn't align with typical expectations, especially when a parent insists on non-casual attire, it raises immediate questions about what really happened behind closed doors. What's even more confounding is the matter of the missing Barbie nightgown. According to Patsy, this was JonBenét's preferred sleepwear, and there were multiple places it could have been: the bathroom drawer, the washer, or the dryer. Yet it vanishes from the scene, which is strange enough on its own. But when theories emerge that the intruder specifically sought out and took the nightgown, it shifts the tone from a simple missing item to a purposeful act. This implies a targeted and personal element to the crime, moving it beyond the possibility of a random burglary or attack. The fiber evidence compounds these questions. Finding black wool fibers matching John's shirt not just on JonBenét's clothes, but inside the long johns is baffling. Fibers usually cling to the outside of clothing from superficial contact, but inside, that suggests intimate, close contact in specific environments, likely in the basement where much of the crime scene evidence is centered. This kind of forensic detail doesn't easily fit the official timelines or parental accounts. It suggests movements and interactions that are not being fully acknowledged or explained. And then there's the issue of clothing consistency between the parent statements and the physical evidence. Patsy's changing story about dressing JonBenet in black velvet pants, John's statements about who dressed the children, and the fiber evidence all collide in ways that undermine the coherence of the narrative. When parents give conflicting details about something as fundamental as clothing, it's a red flag for investigators. It signals potential concealment, confusion, or even deliberate misdirection. We also have to consider how clothing and fiber evidence interplay with behavioral dynamics in the household. Dressing a child, especially one resistant to certain clothes, can be a moment charged with tension, control, and emotion. If JonBenet resisted wearing matching outfits but was eventually dressed in black velvet pants, maybe against her will, that speaks volumes about the family dynamics and emotional environment. It hints at moments of coercion or struggle, which in a forensic context can be meaningful clues. The missing Barbie nightgown plays into this as well. Why was it absent despite there being many places to find it? If an intruder did take it, this suggests premeditation and a psychological fixation on JonBenet specifically. Taking a child's nightgown is a symbolic act. It's not just about the fabric, but about control, humiliation, or sending a message. This kind of behavior is often seen in crimes where the victim is targeted for deeply personal reasons rather than being an unfortunate casualty. Pushing back on the idea that fibers just magically appeared inside JonBenét's long johns is necessary because forensic science doesn't work on magic. It works on probability and physical laws. Fibers can't teleport inside clothing. They have to be transferred through physical contact or handling. This implies that JonBenét's clothes were manipulated in a way that contradicts some statements about who was present, when, and where. It forces us to reconsider parts of the timeline and the actions of everyone involved. That reconsideration opens a broader question about the reliability of memories and testimonies, especially from parents under extreme stress. Trauma affects recall, and sometimes people unconsciously alter stories to protect themselves or cope. But when these altered narratives conflict with solid physical evidence, they raise more than just doubts. They demand rigorous forensic re-examination and possibly new investigative leads. From a criminological and psychological viewpoint, these clothing and fiber discrepancies could reflect attempts to stage or cover up elements of the crime. Staging often involves manipulating evidence or the scene to mislead investigators. If someone intentionally changed clothing timelines or planted fibers, it speaks to a calculated effort to control the narrative and delay discovery. Understanding these behaviors helps criminal profilers identify potential suspects and motives. Looking closer at the long johns, if they were indeed boys' clothing or at least not typical dress pants, it begs the question of whether JonBenet was dressed inappropriately or out of the ordinary for that night. This could be a clue about the level of care she received, or indicate a hurried or forced dressing process. The appropriateness of clothing in forensic context isn't trivial. It can influence how injuries occur, how evidence is transferred, and how events unfolded physically. And when we think about the fact that these long johns would typically be worn under other clothing, it complicates theories about what JonBenet's outerwear looked like that night. Were the white pants and shirt she was supposedly wearing over the long johns really what she had on? Or was the official story simplified or altered? The layering of clothes and fiber evidence should align, but here, the pieces seem misaligned. The interplay between Patsy's changing statements about JonBenet's clothing and the forensic evidence suggests a tension between narrative control and hard facts. This tension is where many investigations stall or veer off course. It highlights how critical it is to integrate physical science with eyewitness accounts and memories, and how discrepancies must be scrutinized, not glossed over. In terms of psychological profiling, these contradictions may indicate attempts to protect certain family members or obscure uncomfortable truths. Whether these attempts arise from fear, guilt, or confusion, they complicate the investigation and affect the emotional healing process for everyone involved. It's also important to consider that some of these discrepancies might stem from normal human error or trauma-induced memory lapses. That doesn't fully excuse inconsistencies, but reminds us to approach testimonies with both skepticism and empathy. Understanding how trauma can warp memory is crucial to interpreting conflicting accounts. However, when physical evidence, like the black wool fibers inside the long johns, directly challenges the parental accounts, it demands more than sympathy. It requires rigorous forensic and investigative attention. Ignoring or downplaying such evidence risks missing critical leads or allowing key truths to remain hidden. Finally, this cluster of oddities around clothing, fibers, and missing items like the Barbie nightgown points to a very fishy set of circumstances. It suggests that the official story about JonBenet's last hours and what she wore is far from settled, and that deep contradictions persist. These contradictions aren't just technicalities. They strike at the heart of what really happened, who was involved, and why. Understanding and unpacking these details is essential for moving closer to the truth. Winding down our discussion, what's most striking is how something as everyday as a child's clothing becomes a linchpin for questions about truth, memory, and forensic reality. The contradictions around what JonBenet wore and the fibers found inside her clothes are not minor details. They shake the foundation of the official narrative and demand serious reconsideration. When stories shift and evidence tells a different tale, it challenges us to think critically about what really happened. As we pull back from these intricate details, it's worth reflecting on how they reveal the complex intersection of family dynamics, forensic science, and criminal behavior. The missing nightgown, the disputed outfits, and the fiber evidence all speak to a story that is layered, emotionally charged, and far from settled. It reminds us that in cases like this, the search for clarity is often tangled with the messiness of human memory and motive. Ultimately, closing this chapter means accepting that no detail is too small to matter, and that every thread, literal and figurative, can help lead us closer to understanding. The story of JonBenet's clothing is a vivid example of how the mundane can become profound, and how the pursuit of truth requires patience, skepticism, and a willingness to look beneath the surface. And with that being said, as always, I appreciate your support. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe if you haven't. And until next time, take care of yourself.